Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. I'm Kyle, and today we are diving into something that is absolutely essential if you are involved in reading, writing, or reviewing research, especially in education, applied linguistics, or really any of the social sciences. So we are tackling research paradigms. Now I know that word paradigm sounds kind of intense, right? A little too theoretical, maybe even a bit scary. But here is the thing. Once we break it down, it's actually super useful. It's not just for philosophy geeks or methodology textbooks. Understanding paradigms is like having a map before you start a journey. Without one, you might still get somewhere, but chances are you'll get lost or confused along the way. So let's get into it. And don't worry, we'll keep it light and practical. What is a research paradigm? All right, first things first. A research paradigm is basically the mindset or worldview that guides a researcher. It's how you use the world, how you think knowledge works, and how you believe we can find out about things. Now, this mindset affects everything: your research questions, your methods, the kind of data you collect, and even how you interpret the data. If you've ever looked at two studies on the same topic and thought, whoa, these feel completely different, it's probably because they are based on different paradigms. And here is where two important building blocks come in: ontology and epistemology. Don't worry, we'll break these down too. Let's start with ontology. So, ontology sounds deep, right? But it's just a fancy word for asking what is reality? Or more simply, what kind of world are we studying? Let me give you a couple of examples. If you believe reality exists out there, independent of us, like facts are facts, whether we believe them or not, then you've got a realist or objective ontology. For example, you might believe that language proficiency is a fixed thing that we can measure, just like blood pressure. But if you believe that reality is shaped by people, culture, and context, that is constructed through interaction, then you're in the constructivist or relativist camp. So in this case, proficiency might look totally different depending on the speaker, the culture, or even the setting, like a Nigerian English speaker versus a British academic. So yeah, ontology is all about what kind of reality you believe you're dealing with. Now, what about epistemology? Next up, epistemology. And again, don't let the term scare you. Epistemology simply asks, how do we know what we know? It's your theory of knowledge. How do you believe knowledge is created or discovered? Here is how it plays out. If you think we gain knowledge through observation and measurable data, then you are leaning toward positivism. Like if you run a massive survey and believe the numbers speak for themselves. If you believe knowledge comes from interpreting people's experiences and meanings, then you are an interpretivist. You might sit down with teachers and ask them how they make sense of teaching English in multilingual classrooms. And if you believe knowledge is shaped by power, history, and inequality, then you are at the critical camp. You might ask, who gets to decide what standard English is? And who gets left out? So just to recap, ontology is what kind of thing are we studying? Epistemology is how do we come to know about it? Together they form the backbone of your paradigm. So, what are the major research paradigms? Positivism, interpretivism, critical theory, and pragmatism. Let's walk through four big ones you will run into, especially in education and applied linguistics. The first one is positivism. Here, the core belief is there is an objective reality out there and we can measure it. The methods we usually use are surveys, experiments, and stats. For example, you measure vocabulary size through a standardized test, easy, clean, number based. The second one is interpretivism. The core belief here is reality is socially constructed. Context is everything. The methods usually used are interviews, observations, and case studies. For example, you explore how immigrant students experience language learning, not just how many words they know. In a critical paradigm, the core belief is knowledge is shaped by power and ideology. The methods mainly used are critical discourse analysis, ethnographies, and participatory action research. For example, you examine how English textbooks represent or exclude non-Western cultures. And the last but not least is pragmatism. The core belief here is using whatever works best to answer your question. The methods are usually mixed methods, that is, qualitative and quantitative. For example, you study teacher burnout using both surveys and follow up interviews. Now, the question is, how does this all shape your methodology? Okay, here is where it really matters. Once you've figured out your paradigm, that mix of ontology and epistemology that determines your methodology. In other words, once you have clarified your paradigm, your ontology and epistemology will guide your methodology. Now you collect and interpret data. You must bear in mind that inconsistent choices can harm research quality. If you say you are constructivist, but you use rigid surveys, critical reviewers will notice. Let me show you how it lines up. If you believe language is real and measurable, you will probably use tests and statistics. If you believe language is socially constructed, you will use interviews and ethnography. If you assume knowledge is objective, you will use experiments and surveys. If you think knowledge is interpretive, then you may use case studies or thematic analysis. And finally, if you assume that knowledge is shaped by power, you might use critical ethnography and action research. The thing is, if your philosophical stand doesn't match your methods, that's a red flag. The reviewers will notice. But why this matters for critical review? Let's say you are reviewing a study. How can all this help? Well, start by asking about the coherence of the study. Do the methods, questions, and interpretations match the paradigm? Ask about transparency. Does the researcher actually tell us their assumptions? And finally, ask about fit. Do the tools match what they claim to believe about reality and knowledge? And watch out for mismatches. Let me give you an example. Say someone says you're using a constructivist approach to study EFL writing, but all they do is run a grammar test. That's a mismatch. Constructivist work should involve things like reflective journals or interviews, or maybe a paper claims to be critical, but never once mentions power, inequality, or marginalization. That's another red flag. Let's break down three major research perspectives on language learning anxiety. First, the positivist approach. This perspective sees anxiety as something that can be measured objectively. Researchers using this method often rely on surveys and a statistical analysis. For example, using a standardized anxiety scales to assess how anxious learners feel when speaking or being tested in a second language. The goal is to identify patterns and make generalizations about anxiety levels across large groups. Next is the interpretivist approach. Here, anxiety is viewed as a personal and subjective experience. Researchers typically use interviews to understand what anxiety feels like for individual learners, how it develops, and what specific classroom situations trigger it. This approach values learners' voices and explores the meaning they attach to their emotional experience. Finally, the critical approach. This framework looks at power relations in the classroom context that may contribute to anxiety. For instance, it might examine how teacher authority, classroom hierarchies, or institutional policies silence learners or create pressure that increases anxiety. The focus here is not just on the learner's feelings, but on how systems and structures produce and reinforce anxiety. So to sum up, positivist uses surveys and statistics to measure anxiety. Interpretivist uses interviews to understand learners' personal experiences of anxiety. And a critical examines how power in the classroom shapes and sustains anxiety. Let's now look at two additional perspectives on writing proficiency in language learning: the realist and the constructivist approaches. First, the realist view. In this approach, writing proficiency is seen as something that can be objectively assessed using rubrics and standardized measures. Researchers or educators might evaluate writing based on features like grammar, coherence, organization, and vocabulary using detailed scoring criteria. The aim is to ensure consistency and fairness in how writing is judged across different learners and contexts. Then there is the constructivist perspective. This approach sees writing as a social and cultural practice. It focuses on the cultural meaning of writing, how learners' backgrounds, identities, and prior experiences shape the way they write and interpret writing tasks. From this view, proficiency isn't just about correctness or form, it's also about how well learners can express ideas that make sense in a particular cultural or communicative context. So, in summary, a realist focuses on rubrics and measurable features of writing. The constructivist explores the cultural and contextual meaning behind learners' writing. Now, let's talk about some common red flags to watch out for in research design analysis. The first is paradigm mismatch. This happens when there is a disconnect between the research claims and the methods used. For example, a study might make qualitative claims, like trying to understand learners' personal experiences or perceptions, but then rely solely on quantitative tools, such as surveys or test scores. There is a mismatch because qualitative questions require qualitative methods, like interviews or observations, to be answered meaningfully. The next red flag is when studies make critical claims without any social analysis. In other words, the research might claim to address issues of power, inequality, or marginalization, but then fails to actually engage with social or institutional structures in its analysis. A truly critical study needs to dig into how systems, roles, or ideologies affect learners, not just state its inequality exists. So, in summary, be cautious of paradigm mismatches where the tools don't match the questions. Be skeptical of critical claims that aren't backed by real social critique or analysis. Here are some tips for doing a solid critical review. So, if you're reviewing a paper or writing your own, keep these in mind. One, start with the paradigm. Can you tell what it is? Two, check for alignment. Do all the parts make sense together? Three, look for reflexivity. Does a researcher admit where they are coming from? Number four, evaluate methodological fit. Are the tools right for the worldview? Five, question assumptions. Are they treating cultural norms as neutral? And here we come with the final thoughts. All right, let's wrap this up. Research paradigms aren't just abstract theory. They shape everything: your questions, your tools, your conclusions, your credibility. If you are serious about doing or reviewing research in education or applied linguistics, understanding this stuff isn't just helpful, It is foundational. Try this before you go. Try answering these two questions about your own research. What do you believe about the nature of the thing you are studying? That's your ontology. And how do you think you can best understand it? That's your epistemology. Drop your answers in the comments. I love to hear them. Thanks so much for watching. If this helped clarify things, give it a like, share it with someone who's working on their thesis or proposal. And don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives like this. Until next time, stay curious, stay critical, and keep asking the big questions.